is on climate change and what can the Reed community do about it. I'm Kim Spencer. I'm from the class of 1970. I studied political science, then got involved in video, and first was a journalist here at the Reed College Quest. And now I work for a TV channel called Link TV, which airs a lot of programs on climate. So for the last 15 years, I spent a lot of time looking at documentaries and programs on climate issues and energy alternatives. So it's really great to be here. I have this really great panel that I'll introduce to you right now. To my right is Maya Jarrad, and she's Reed class of 14. Got her degree in environmental studies, economics, and now is working as a researcher in the Reed economics department. And I'll tell you later more about what she's doing. But she's also a member of the 350 PDX organization, which we're hearing more about. Next to Maya is Hubert from the class of 66, physics. He, after his degree in physics, he went to Texas A&M and got his PhD in experimental low temperature physics, and then went to work in 1970 with Chevron and worked as a physicist in various different roles until 1999, and he's now a member of the Reed College trustees. Kate Jentoft-Hess is currently a student. She's going to be a senior next year in environmental chemistry. She's from Washington, D.C., and she's been heavily involved in Fossil-Free Reed, an organization that you're going to hear more about. And next to her is Harlan Shober from the class of 70. I remember Harlan from many years ago and ran into him at one of the wonderful potlucks that he does on occasional Saturdays here for folks. And Harlan has been an airline pilot and now operates the Drizzlewood Farm, South Portland, and is also a member of various environmental groups in the area. And to Harlan's right is a guest that Harlan has invited in, Brian Brumley, who was a longtime journalist for the Associated Press. He reported from Moscow, Tehran, Tokyo, Warsaw, London, and finally was the AP bureau chief in Oregon for many years. And he is now a financial advisor and works specializing in sustainable, responsible, and impact investing. So that is our panel. And the ground rules, and we really hope to make this interactive and have those of you in the audience get really involved after we sort of hear from our panelists up here. So we're going to try to limit the opening talks to about 5 minutes each, and then we'll do a little round back and forth, and then after that, we'd like to open it up to the rest of the folks here in the audience. So if you have a question, try to hang on to it so you can remember it, and we'll be passing a microphone around, or you can just raise your hand. I'll be sure to repeat any questions that you have when it happens. So, Maya.
Great. Is the microphone good here? Yeah? Okay. So my name is Maya Jarrad. I graduated a year ago. And Kim said I'm working for the economics department. I am very thrilled that my thesis was rolled into a USDA grant. So I was able to stay at Reed on a USDA grant because of the work I was doing on my thesis. That's very exciting and has nothing to do with this panel. And I also was involved with Fossil-Free Reed, which is Reed College's group that's working on climate change. So I quickly want to ask everyone, just to see sort of who we have in the room, if you would close your eyes quick and raise your hand if you feel that Reed is doing enough or should not take additional action to reduce or slow climate change. Okay, you can open your eyes. Yeah, there were 0 hands raised, so that's a very good sign. So I was a member of Reed's Green Board, which for those of you who graduated more than a handful of years ago, is Reed's environmental group on campus. And they're responsible right now for putting on Canyon Day every year, twice a year, and working on projects on campus to increase Reed's sustainability. And a faction of that group broke off in 2013 and decided that one of the campaigns that they were going to work on is divestment from fossil fuels. Okay, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand again. Could you raise your hand if you have an understanding of what divestment means? Cool, that's exciting. So I'll explain it a little bit because I had some shaky hands going. Divestment is moving investments from one group of companies or part of the industry, part of an industry, and taking those investments out and putting them elsewhere in the market or investing them in a different type of financial investment. So the idea behind fossil fuel divestment is removing investments in fossil fuel industry. So that's large coal, oil, and gas, either refineries or extraction companies. And the thinking behind divestment as a tactic for limiting climate change is the potential to leverage and alter the systems of power that perpetuate carbon emissions. Primarily, we're looking at the fossil fuel industry. And I recognize that we all use fossil fuels, but also looking at how our political system right now is affected and influenced by the fossil fuel industry, especially through lobbying, through campaign donations, and other mechanisms. So this group, Fossil Free Reed, basically is looking at trying to shift the frame in which we're working and not working on swapping out one type of product for a potentially greener or sustainable product. That probably isn't going to make that much of a difference, but really looking at where's the power structure, where's the money, who's playing, who's game, and trying to change how we consider what's an action that will make a difference. This campaign is not unique, and we're not the first school to have this, and there are many other schools who are working on this, and many governments who are looking at divesting fossil fuels. And the last thing I'll say is that the goal of our campaign is not to bankrupt the fossil fuel industry. That removing investments, even if there are many, many groups of people who remove investments from these industries, it's pretty small in terms of their total assets for shareholders. And but really the goal is to show our political leaders that there's space, that we open up space for them to create real climate policy that's actually may have an influence on our carbon emissions as state level and at the national level. This is based on the assumption that the fossil fuel industry has a lot of power in politics right now. So if you disagree with that, then you probably disagree with the campaign. But I feel like that's a pretty accurate assumption. So I'll pause there.
Okay. Jacob, put the mic up.
Sure. Well, I think the first thing to say is that the vast majority of thinking people, reasonable people, people who use reason, understand that increased emissions of carbon dioxide are a serious problem that really needs to be mitigated and reduced as quickly as possible. And this is not necessarily a perspective that's shared by everybody. There's a certain minority in society that we would call climate change deniers. James Inhofe, Republican senator from Oklahoma, well known for saying climate change or global warming is a hoax. And I think he says that not so much because he believes it's true, but because he's opposed to government influence in making decisions, and that a lot of the decisions that what he's really opposed to is reducing the power and influence of corporations in Oklahoma, just for example. We recognize there was a recent book 2 years ago by Reedies and a co-author called Merchants of Doubt that explains how elderly retired scientists can be hired by industry to make an argument that casts some doubt on the scientific validity of climate change. And I think these are bogus arguments, just as they were in the case of tobacco. Nonetheless, sometimes the public is confused by a fair and balanced presentation that acts as if there's an equal number of people on each side of an argument like that. And as Kim said, I'm a retired Chevron employee, and I think one of the interesting things to say about that is that virtually all of the scientists and engineers that I worked with at Chevron, including myself, felt that one of the real important changes that could be made in society was to increase the price of fuels. That when we look at Europe, for example, they pay the same price for crude oil that we do, and yet when you buy a liter of gasoline in Europe, you pay a lot more, and the difference is flowing into government. And obviously the fossil fuel industry opposes that kind of thing. I think recently the chairman of Chevron and the chairman of Exxon said that they thought that the future was nuclear and possibly in the long term shale extraction, that there was plenty of fuel. And I think in some sense it's correct to say that there is plenty of fossil fuel, but it's also, in my mind, it's also true that we shouldn't be using it, at least not in the long term, that we need to move away from that. Now, I also think that sometimes we get a little confused because we recognize that the Montreal agreements on emissions of halogenated hydrocarbons, which is to say refrigerating gases, were very effective. And that's sometimes compared to CO2 emissions, and people say, well, gee, if Montreal was successful, why can't Kyoto be successful? And there are a couple of important differences there. One is there were a very limited number of halogenated hydrocarbon manufacturers. It was easy to identify them and regulate them. In the case of CO2 emissions, we're all sitting here producing CO2, and we can't point at any one of us and say, you need to stop. Whereas you could say that with halogenated hydrocarbons. The other point is you could identify those halogenated hydrocarbons by testing. You could easily say, you're the bad guy, stop it. And with CO2, there's no such similar ability. And I support the decision of the board to oppose divestment, not because I think that we shouldn't make statements about these things, but because it's ultimately not the most effective action that can be taken. But I think what's really important is taking meaningful action that's focused on reducing carbon dioxide emissions, because that absolutely must be done future of our species and the amount of change that we're going to have to endure depends critically on getting to the point and doing something about carbon dioxide emissions. And in my mind, economic stimulus is one of the very best ways to do that. I mean, I don't know what you see in Portland, but during the period when gas prices were very high, people started buying Priuses, and when the prices of gasoline started coming down, they started switching back to larger vehicles again. So I think changes in pricing can make a big difference. I'm very much in favor of carbon taxes, and I think there are ways to manage international agreements about carbon taxes and tariffs on carbon emissions that would be lead to productive and meaningful action. And we're going to be using this, like I said, we're going to be using fossil fuels for a long time, but we need to move as quickly as we can to reducing the amount that we use. And as an example of something that I think is ineffective, that's sometimes touted, is Stanford University's so-called divestment, when what they did was stop investing in coal industries. And in my mind, coal was a poor investment in the first place, and what they've done is create the perception of create the perception that they're virtuous, when in fact it's just a simple necessity that they were going to do anyway. And I don't feed my wife anymore either. So.
Thank you, Jay. Okay, Kate?
All right. There's a lot of things I can talk about. I'll talk a little bit about what I do at Reed. I just finished my junior year as an environmental studies chemistry major. That means, environmental studies is a new program at Reed. It's 4 years old, and we have this junior seminar that is focused exclusively on climate change. And I just finished that last semester. We actually read Emergence of Doubt in that class. We talked a lot about different theories and practices that can be applied to climate change. I also am currently one of the student leaders of Green Board, which is the group that I met Maya in, and I also am the only remaining veteran member of Fossil Free Reed because everyone else has graduated. There are 9 new freshmen this year, and that was so incredible to see that. We struggle at Reed a lot of times in student groups with getting involvement and participation. Everyone has their own driving goal in life, and a lot of times those don't necessarily lend to student activism, but to get 9 new freshmen was really cool, and they have been really inspiring, and are one of the reasons I'm staying in Portland is their energy, and they're all home for the summer, so I can't be here, but we met in April with the Board of Trustees for the 4th time. And it was probably the most disappointing meeting that we've had with them, because they basically told us that divestment was never going to be a possibility at Reed, pretty much for anything. Roger Perlmutter, one of the freshmen, asked Roger would divestment ever be an allowable course of action. After we had a long dialogue about divestment as a symbolic statement, divestment as a political statement, divestment as a moral statement, the trustees did not think that any of those were grounds for divestment, and we firmly disagree with that, and we really do believe that all of those reasons are good reasons for divestment, and good reasons that Reed should support divestment. But Roger Perlmutter said, after being asked if divestment would ever be allowed, he replied, "I can imagine a circumstance where it could be possible. That could happen. We are not close now, but it could happen." I left that meeting very confused because I cannot imagine a more vital issue than climate change. We have never faced anything as a species that could be as destructive as climate change, and it does not make sense to me to mess around with it and to honestly to prioritize profits over doing what I believe is the right thing in divesting. I don't think that we should be invested in something that is destroying the planet. And I don't think that we should be getting money from these companies because of their continued destruction, and I think that it is very dishonorable for Reed and the college to remain in these investments, and that is the stance that fossil fuel has taken. We have received criticism from the board because they think that we should be focusing on reducing our carbon footprint, and our response was that we should do both, that we should simultaneously work towards divestment and we should simultaneously work towards a carbon neutral campus. We officially changed our name to Fossil Free Reed this year, and we will continue to work towards both of those goals.
The year I left Reed, 1970, was the year that Jim Henson predicted peak oil. And around that time, I heard for the first time the expression that we were a petroleum culture. And at first, I really took offense to that. It seemed like we had all those Greek buildings and all that classical music and stuff, and we shouldn't think of ourselves as a petroleum culture. It just rubbed me the wrong way. Then I proceeded to have a career in aviation where not much happens unless 1, 2, 3, or 4 engines are running. And I have now retired to running a farm where not much happens unless I'm either operating a tractor or a chainsaw or something else, burning fuel. And I commute between Portland and the farm at the cost of 2 to 4 gallons a round trip. So I'm really on the hook on this. I'm also under threat from the oil and gas people because they want to put a 36-inch, they used to, a few years ago they were pushing very hard to put a 36-inch high-pressure LNG pipeline across one most valuable field. So that made me very uncomfortable. The argument then was that we absolutely need to import, this is 2007, 2008, the argument then was that we absolutely had to import this gas to keep the wheels of industry turning, to keep my neighbors employed, that they would use eminent domain to steal my front field because it was for the public good, and I had to agree. If my neighbor needs this gas to have a job, I guess that's what eminent domain is. They've since pivoted to the idea that we must now export fuel to not just make American industry rich, but to make Canadian companies rich. They still want to use eminent domain to steal my front field, to push the gas the other direction. And so I've gotten a little bit involved with No KXL, Climate Action Coalition. I'm getting involved with 350. About a year ago, Henson came back to Portland and I heard him speak, and he made the case that getting a Prius wouldn't much make a difference, that the fuel has to stay in the ground, and whether we get more or fewer miles out of that fuel doesn't make so much difference as keeping it in the ground. So my enthusiasm for, among other things, Reed's divesting is based on the idea that while I completely